Thank you. My name is Kellen Macbeth. I am the chair of the county's Housing Commission, and I'm also on the executive committee for the Arlington NAACP branch. My views, as expressed today, are my own and may or may not reflect the views of anyone else I'm associated with. You can do the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the progress that's been made. If you came last year, I had similar slides talking about what had happened from 23 to 24. We're going to talk about what's happened from 24 to 25. Some new emerging challenges that have popped up, some that have been existing for a little while. Then we're going to talk about sort of the state of fair housing enforcement in the county, equity in policymaking, affordable housing, and then disparities in access to opportunity. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as far as progress, we have a lot of progress in fair housing testing. So the Office of Human Rights, which is the office within the county that's responsible for fair housing enforcement, they issued a contract with the Equal Rights Center last year to conduct fair housing testing. This is significant because the county had not actually conducted fair housing testing since 2019, which they said, oh, we didn't because of COVID. I don't remember COVID being 4 years long, but that was what we were told. So they conducted the testing May through August of 2024. And what was also significant, for the first time, they didn't just test race, ethnicity, and national origin, which is what the county, I think, had solely tested for, I want to say, at least a decade or more. And they expanded it to include source of funds, familial status, disability, and national origin. Why is that important? Well, disability is where the vast majority of fair housing complaints come from. It's based on disability status, and we never tested for it. So the fact that the county expanded their testing, and hopefully in the future they're going to continue to expand that, because what we know is that a lot more housing discrimination is taking place than we receive complaints. If you go out into the community and you talk to people, especially low-income residents, they'll talk about how they face discrimination on a somewhat regular basis. I'm not saying everyone is experiencing this, but these are conversations that as housing commission members or the NAACP, we hear about this. But what we don't see are corresponding cases filed with the Office of Human Rights, or even with HUD, or with the State Fair Housing Office. So the testing report from that testing has not been released yet. I'm hoping that will be soon. I think the county's had it for about 6 months. So, fingers crossed any day we'll actually find out about the results of that. And also exciting news, the Housing Rights Initiative, which is based out of New York City, they've begun doing source of funds testing in Arlington as of April 2024. So in addition to the testing that the county's funded, we now have another nonprofit that's doing testing specifically around source of funds. Next slide. So another win, the Office of Human Rights got a budget increase this year, so thank you to the county board. The board added, I believe it's $35,000, it's between $10,000 and $35,000, I'm waiting for clarification, for fair housing enforcement and education for the fiscal year 2026 budget. And they also have instructed the Office of Human Rights to do annual fair housing testing. So as I said before, we had a gap from 2019 to 2024 in testing. Then they talked about doing testing every other year. Now the board has said you need to do testing every year. Because testing is a really powerful tool to make sure that landlords and property owners know if you discriminate, we may catch you, and not just because we're waiting on people to file complaints, which they know as well as us that a lot of people don't file complaints. But if we're doing proactive testing, the chances of getting caught if you're violating the law are much greater. And that's a really powerful tool to push back and say, don't violate our laws, because we'll find out and there'll be consequences. So that's really important. So those are the good things that have happened in the last year. Next slide, please. Next one. So what are some emerging challenges? So it was really exciting. We heard about the Washington Regional Fair Housing Plan. So the county board in Arlington adopted that in July of 2023. But it's been approximately 2 years. There's very limited information that the county has provided about the status of the implementation. So across the Fair Housing Plan, we have 7 regional goals, 6 local goals, and then for the regional goals, there's 23 sub-goals and 35 sub-goals for the local one. As someone who is very passionate about fair housing in Arlington, and I spent a lot of time and energy, whether that's the Housing Commission or the NAACP, trying to learn as much as I can, I can't tell you what the county's doing for most of these. And when I've asked county staff, the answer I get is, we're not going to provide updates on all of these. That's not a good use of staff time. To me, that's not transparent. I think if the county approves a plan and says we're going to do this, then the county has an obligation to tell people this is what we've done, or this is what we're not doing, and here's why. So that's definitely an area for improvement. And a lot of the key enforcement goals, there's been no progress made in 2 years, which is disappointing. And this is spanning multiple departments. So in addition to the Office of Human Rights, which does fair housing enforcement, you also have the Department of Community Planning, Housing Development, Department of Human Services, and the Department of Environmental Services, who all have a role related to implementation of the Fair Housing Plan. It's really a whole of government effort. And I think we want to know what's happening and what's not happening. Next slide, please. Also, disparities are worsening in Arlington. So in December of 2024, the Public Health Division released an update to the Destination 2027 report, which outlined basically looking at who you are and where you live, what disparities in health outcomes would look like because of that. So it was a big deal in 2019 when the report first came out that said that there was a 10-year life expectancy gap based on what neighborhood you live in and the color of your skin. Unfortunately, by 2024, that's now 11 years. So things are worse than they were. And if you look at the chart up here, you can see that overall the county is doing better, but in a lot of key areas, disparities have increased. So more people are doing better, but if you look at people of color versus white people, you see greater disparities than we saw before in life expectancy, premature deaths, teen births, and children in poverty. So that means that part of this was during COVID-19, there was a change in focus. And what the Public Health Division says, basically things paused, the progress paused at that time, and then it never really resumed or got better, and in some cases got worse. So this is directly related to when we look at AFFH and looking at disparities in access to opportunity, this is what we're talking about. Next slide, please. I know we just talked a little bit about missing middle, but the NAACP, really across the country, the NAACP is for missing middle. We're for reversing the history of segregation and discrimination across all of our communities. And the Arlington branch was no exception to that. As we heard, the court struck that down. There's an appeal process, but that was a blow to what we're trying to achieve with fair housing. Next slide, please. Also, we're seeing a lot of issues still with housing voucher recipients facing discrimination in our county. So I talked about some positives. There's more testing that's happening, but we're also hearing about more discrimination. So in that testing, we don't have the final report, but the Office of Human Rights did say that the Equal Rights Center did find source of funds discrimination happening in Arlington. And also, right now, the county is doing a strategic planning process for the Housing Choice Voucher Program, where the recipients of those vouchers are talking about discrimination that they're facing. And it's not just, the landlord won't rent to me because I have a voucher, but it's once they're in a unit, they feel like the landlords treat them differently because they have a voucher, because they feel like the landlord knows it's not easy for me to go someplace else, so maintenance is slower than my peers in the building. I get treated differently by office staff. They feel like they have lower quality access to amenities, and as I said, just worse treatment from property staff because they feel like they have a voucher, they're treated differently. And they feel discriminated against because they have children or children with disabilities. So this is feedback that the county's been getting as part of their strategic planning process that shows that we need to step up enforcement. We need to be doing a lot more to go after these landlords. It shouldn't just be the Department of Human Services hears these complaints and we publish a report about it. But what is the Office of Human Rights then doing to make sure that we end this discrimination in our county? And that's where the disconnect is, that we publish the report and we say, oh, this sucks, someone needs to do something. But then we don't have our enforcement staff actually doing something to stop it. Next slide, please. Next slide. So talking about part of the enforcement, so our human rights ordinance. So the county's human rights ordinance, I don't know when it was first written, but basically it's not aligned with the federal fair housing law and also the Virginia fair housing law. There's a lot of differences. There's different definitions of protected classes. There's things that the state and HUD can do that the county office can't do. Like, for instance, there's no subpoena power during investigations, which if you are part of the, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, the Fair Housing Assistance Program for HUD, which Fairfax is, but Arlington is not, that's a requirement that you have to have that power to be able to do effective investigations for fair housing. Our ordinance does not give that power to the Office of Human Rights. Also, fair housing lawsuits. So if you go through the conciliation process after you found a cause, and you say, okay, the landlord or whomever does not want to conciliate, we need to sue, that requires approval from the county board to actually take that case, which is problematic because you shouldn't have a political body who can get influenced by whoever it is coming to the board and lobbying them and saying, no, don't sue me. I don't want you to, not because I didn't do anything wrong, but for political reasons, I'll make it worth your while. Not to say that our board would respond to that, but they shouldn't be put in the position where they're able to be lobbied over something that's really just facts of the law. We also, another example, we only give 180 days to file a complaint instead of a year. So HUD and the state, they give someone a year from when they have experienced a fair housing violation to file a complaint. It's half the time in Arlington. So opportunities. The NAACP Arlington branch and home of Virginia analyzed the human rights ordinance and in December sent a letter to the county board saying, here are all the changes that you should make so that you can be consistent with the federal fair housing law and the Virginia fair housing law. Unfortunately, action has not been taken yet by the county, and I don't think we actually got a response from that letter from the county board. But that's something that I think Home and the NAACP try to make it as easy as possible to say, here are all the changes that legally you'd be required to make it to become a fair housing assistance program and to be consistent with other fair housing enforcers at the state or the federal level. Next slide, please. So generally just talking about the fair housing process. So Arlington hasn't brought a fair housing lawsuit in 20 years. So it's possible that we're really good at conciliation, or it's possible that there's something about our process that could be off. We don't accept anonymous claims, and we don't investigate pattern and practice violations in the county. We also have an office that's understaffed and underfunded. So we're missing 2 staff currently. There's 2 vacant positions. And we heard from the director of the Office of Fair Housing in March who said, I could use more staff to do what we're trying to do. And their attention is split between enforcing internal county EEO complaints and enforcing all of the human rights ordinance to the public. And what is clear to me, and I think a lot of other people, that the focus is on internal EEO complaints, and that's where staff spends most of their time, and much less attention goes towards the external enforcement of the human rights ordinance, which is problematic in the environment where HUD is not going to do these investigations anymore. They're cutting their staff, and they're rolling back protections, and they're saying we're not going to enforce the law as it's written. We know that Virginia is overwhelmed with their fair housing office because they're understaffed. And we currently have an attorney general who has one attorney to handle all civil rights cases in any area. So that's employment, public accommodation, fair housing. So we have a fair housing board at the state level that doesn't even send cases. They just find no cause because they know they're not going to get prosecuted anyway. So what's the point? So what's left is Arlington to try to enforce fair housing law within our own community. So what are some opportunities? So in January, HUD came to a housing commission meeting and said, Arlington, we would love to work with you to become a fair housing assistance program. We can do this quickly. And please let us know whatever we can do to make this happen, because we would love to have you join this program to get money and funding from us to do cases, as well as training and other resources to help build up your capacity. To my knowledge, since that offer was made, nothing has happened. The Housing Commission, after that same meeting, recommended fast-tracking becoming a fair housing assistance program. And we do know that in the Trump administration's budget request, while they are proposing eliminating all FIP program funding, they have left untouched the FAP program funding. So the Fair Housing Assistance Program, which is localities or states actually doing the fair housing enforcement, they have not proposed eliminating that budget like they have for nonprofit partners. So it does look like the Fair Housing Assistance Program is going to remain in place, at least for the time being. Another opportunity is there is additional funding and attention from the county board. I think just having the Office of Human Rights speak at a budget hearing in March was a big deal, and that hadn't happened before. So thank you to the board for inviting them to come and speak. And also, thank you to the board for adding funding to do fair housing education and enforcement to the Office of Human Rights. That was a big step that we hadn't seen in quite some time. Next slide, please. With fair housing education outreach, I've kind of already covered this, but a lot of residents just don't understand what the law is, they don't understand what their rights are, and they don't know how to enforce them. We experience this, as I said, all the time, talking to especially low-income tenants. They'll tell you what's happened to them, and you're saying, oh, that's a fair housing violation, and they have no idea. They just know that they've been mistreated, but they don't understand if it's a tenant-landlord violation or a fair housing violation, and they don't know, or they may not feel comfortable going through the process to try to seek redress. So there's a lot more outreach, there's a lot more relationship building that we could be doing to make sure that they feel comfortable saying, I'm being discriminated against, like, please help me. And also we know from the Regional Fair Housing Plan that 75% of those surveyed by the Metropolitan Washington Council government said that they face housing discrimination. 75% of those who said they faced housing discrimination did not report it. So what are the opportunities? Same as before, that the county board has added funding to help address some of this. I think it's a good step in the right direction, but there's more that's needed. Next slide, please. Equity in policymaking. Next slide. So equity analysis. So here, looking at, I guess the Fair Housing Plan has a provision in it to say that all governments across the region should incorporate equity analysis into major land use decision-making, major housing policy decision-making. And Arlington has started to do that. So if you look at racial analysis, or racial equity analysis, that is part of our site plan process in the county. We do have information in the packets that go to the board as well as the commissions about that. But it's only focused on racial equity. It's not focused on impacts to immigrants, LGBTQ plus folks, people in the disability community, or other historically marginalized groups. So again, it's a good step in the right direction. Racial equity analysis is very important, but there's other marginalized groups as well that we're not really looking at when we look at what are the impacts of proposed land use decisions. And then Arlington has limited authority to do something about what they learned from the racial equity analysis. So when a site plan says, okay, this area was home to historically marginalized folks, and they've been mistreated for generations, there's very little that the county can do to require the developer to remedy that situation. Our prescribed tools in the affordable housing ordinance and the state enabling legislation don't give the county a lot of flexibility to negotiate for, we want money for displacement relief. We want money for, X, Y, and Z. They're not allowed to ask for those things. That's not part of the affordable housing ordinance, and that's not part of what they can do for site plans. So expanding that authority is something that the Housing Commission is working with a coalition of community members to figure out how do we change the affordable housing ordinance, not just to look at incorporating equity processes, but also how do we get more affordable housing. So that's a key focus, but at the same time we're saying, as with everything we do, we should be looking at how do we advance equity through this. Next slide, please. Equitable engagement. So Arlington has struggled to engage with historically marginalized groups on housing policy and decision making. I know oftentimes, especially homeowners, don't feel like this is the case, but from sitting in the Housing Commission and in the SPRC meetings, the groups that are always represented are the civic associations and any homeowners who are the loudest voices in the room, and if they don't like something, they will be heard. The people who are not in the room, tenants. The people who are not in the room, low-income people. You don't see a lot of historically marginalized people there either. They're not part of the conversation because oftentimes it's harder to get them to the table. And the county has they've tried, but the value of a dollar goes further getting a homeowner to show up than it does getting a low-income renter to show up to a meeting. So that's something that the Housing Commission is also looking at. We're studying changes to the public engagement process for how housing policy and land use decisions are made. And we're planning to do recommendations to the county board on how things can change to ensure that we have better representation of historically marginalized groups in this decision making. So it's not just the people who have the time and the money to be there and influence the process, but the people who are most impacted by and who historically have not been involved in any of these processes, that they also have a seat at the table and their voices are heard. Next slide, please. Next slide. So affordable housing challenges. So with rental housing, Arlington has a severe shortage of affordable apartments. Only 12.1% of housing units are affordable at 60% of area median income. The goal for the Affordable Housing Master Plan by I think 2040 is 17.7%. So the county has made strides. Barcroft was a huge addition of more affordable units, but there's a lot more that we need. Unfortunately this year, it was a tough budget year, so we saw a lot less money going towards our Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which helps provide gap financing for a lot of these projects. But we need more funding like that, and we need other avenues to try and increase the number of affordable housings that are coming online every year. We also have a shortage of affordable units to extremely low-income residents. So last year, the county board took steps to set aside a specific, I think it was $1 million for the Affordable Housing Investment Fund, specifically for the creation of units that were affordable at 30% of AMI or below. So that's your very low income, extremely low income folks. And that wasn't replicated this year again. It was a tough budget year, but the need didn't go away. We also have a shortage of family size units and accessible units. So these are all things that, as we look at opportunities, changing the affordable housing ordinance, if it passes the General Assembly, well, if it passes the county board and they like it, then it goes to our General Assembly and they pass it, the governor signs it. We have an opportunity to increase the amount of affordable housing that we get because developer contributions or on-site units or off-site units, that could increase. But there's a lot of steps between here and there. Right now, we're figuring it out. We got a lot of smart people who are coming together every month to see why do we have it the way we have it now, and what does that look like going forward. But that's what we're working towards. Yep, Barbara.
I would just say, for the group that's working on a proposal to go to the county board, which will also then have to go to the General Assembly, just make sure the developers and all the stakeholders are at the table, because they will show up in Richmond, and you don't want us to have to negotiate something that the county board, would be an afterthought, if you will. So just make sure all your stakeholders are at the table. It was a struggle getting that current proposal, which is now your ordinance, which is in statute. It was a struggle getting it as progressive as it is. Just saying. So don't just talk to yourself, talk to all the stakeholders.
We had developers sitting on the subcommittee, and there's going to be a whole public engagement process as well to talk through it. And I've heard the same things, Barbara, from county board members as we've talked about this, that you need to make sure that developers are at the table so that they don't sabotage us later. So that is something that the Housing Commission is working to do. I can't guarantee that everyone's going to be happy with the end result, especially if it means they have to pay more money and the community gets a better deal and developers get less. But I think one of the things we're looking at too is that a lot of our neighbors, like Fairfax and Alexandria, they're getting better deals than we're getting in Arlington. And so we're trying to fix that. With home ownership, next slide. So this has come up as a sort of regional and national issue, but homeownership rates are significantly lower for Black, Indigenous, and people of color populations in the county. And then Arlington's existing affordable homeownership programs help very few households. So opportunities, the county released a homeownership study report last year with recommendations to expand access to homeownership. It's unclear some of the more aggressive aspects of it. Is it going to happen? Are we going to be able to do it? Part of it was really dependent on some HUD funding that I don't believe we've heard if we're going to get. I don't know if HUD is planning to make those grants. I can't think of the name of the specific grant that we applied for.
The pro-housing grant?
It might have been pro-housing. And a lot of the more, as I said, aggressive plans for affordable home ownership were tied to getting that money from HUD. And as the federal government says, we don't care about affordable housing, we don't care about helping people get into homes, then a casualty are local programs like this that we're hoping to use that money to advance affordable home ownership in our own community. So we're going to have to be creative and look at other things. I think there were other recommendations in the plan that looked at tweaking some existing programs and making some other changes, but the really significant ones were really tied to getting federal funding for that. Next slide, please. And this sort of dovetails with the rental housing aspect, but the affordable housing development, we talked about this last year. Construction costs and interest rates remain high. They were increasing and they're still high, and that's a huge problem. We also see an increased weaponization of historic preservation status to halt affordable housing projects. So we have a lot of neighbors who don't want any density. They don't want affordable housing. They don't want non-affordable housing. They just don't want anything else in their neighborhood. And they're looking for any possible tool. And we've seen a market increase in using historic preservation status as a way to try to stop affordable housing projects from moving forward. By saying, oh, you can't build affordable housing there because someone once walked by that building and said something that I think is historic, and now it has to go through a year-long process to determine whether that's accurate or not. As we tear down actual historic things, because we have no ability to stop that, but if it's an apartment building that someone doesn't want to go up, they're all historic now. So that's a real problem that we're seeing now. And as part of that, the approval process and neighborhood opposition adds time and cost of projects. What we often see, as I said, is If a market rate housing development goes up, people say they attack it because this doesn't have enough affordable housing, so you shouldn't build this. It doesn't go with the county's goals on affordable housing. If they did a complete 180 and switched it to all affordable housing, they would say, not in my neighborhood. We don't want additional low-income people living here, and we shouldn't have to absorb the burden of having, more affordable housing in my neighborhood. Because the key is they just don't want it. They don't want those new neighbors. They don't want their neighborhood to change. They want it to stay the way it is, and they will find any excuse, any reason to oppose it. But what does that do? It creates uncertainty in the development process. It adds costs. It makes it unfriendly to have to go through the engagement process. And it leads developers and other people to stay away from it because of the increased costs. So as I said, we're looking at potential changes to the Affordable Housing Ordinance as a potential solution for this, but it can only do so much. Next slide, please. Disparities in access to opportunity. Next slide. So access to quality schools. Again, as we look at things from the angle of AFFH, which is housing is sort of the centerpiece for how you experience the world around you. So the neighborhood you live in very much determines the schools that you go to, the job opportunities that you have available, the transportation access that you have. There's so many other things that are impacted by where you live. And a lot of people have limited options of where they live, especially if they're low income. So when we talk about fair housing, it may seem weird to talk about access to quality schools, but that's directly related to where you live and the housing available to you. So we've seen significant gaps in access to high-performing schools among Black and Hispanic students and their peers. And we've seen that in South Arlington, especially near Shirlington, where I live, and Fairlington, access to proficient schools is the lowest in the county. So what are we doing about that? There are some things. So at least for Arlington Public Schools, they adopted their 2024-2030 strategic plan. And one of the things that came out during that public engagement process was you can't just look at overall rates of proficiency and student scores. You have to look at it by school so that you can see, who's not performing, who is performing. Because similar to when we look at public health, right? Like a lot of the public health outcomes for the county went up, but disparities worsened at the same time. And you can see the same thing in education, that, overall, APS may be doing better in certain areas, but if certain schools are doing worse and others are doing a lot better, that's still a huge problem that has to be solved. So at least APS is tracking by school, the student achievement growth as part of the metrics. Next slide, please. So access to healthy neighborhoods. So we kind of talked about this earlier, but the life expectancy gap is now up to 11 years instead of 10 years. So we've worsened since 2019 when the Destination 2027 report first came out. Residents are 8 times more likely to be hospitalized for issues with asthma in neighborhoods with large Black populations compared to some predominantly white neighborhoods. So we still have these health disparities that we need to resolve. And opportunities here. So right now the county doesn't have a public health director. And so the Destination 2027 steering committee has sort of gone defunct in the meantime. But hopefully once a new public health director is hired, this can become a key focus again. There's a lot of things to focus on with public health, given, again, what's happening in the federal environment and a lot of the budget cuts that are being made and the impact that'll have on our local communities. But making sure that we don't just look at the overall outcomes, but we look at outcomes by, population group and by neighborhood. That's really core to AFFH. And with that, questions?
Not a question, just a couple comments. And I need to bring this up to board members, but I was thinking that one way to deal with the historic affairs and land use review board issues that we're seeing might be to, and I don't know what's feasible, but if we got a policy in place that said that if the property is not already on Arlington's historic resource index, it's not going to be considered. That's already been considered, right? The whole process already happened. Every property in the county has been looked at. So, and that's a 3-tier system. If you're not even on the bottom tier, what are we wasting staff time for and builders an entire year to figure out, guess what? It wasn't historic. We already knew that. So I do wonder, I don't know retroactively if that would work, but something logical like that seems like it would help to kind of like, these are the standards, these are the cutoffs. If you didn't meet this cutoff, then, you know, I'm sorry.
Amen.
So that's one. And the other, you know, Kellen, I just wanted to commend you. You know, you are bringing the voice of fair housing and all these components to our county in a way that no one else is or has. You have, you know, really been an accelerator in many of these areas. The affordable, fair housing, the COG effort around the entire region, you made that happen for Arlington. These conferences you're making happen. So I just want to commend you and say thank you for your vision, for your, you know, your energy, your advocacy, because you're making a big difference. So thank you. Thank you.
Freddie Page here. I really like that point about being careful about some of the historic preservation processes, but I've had some students looking at historic preservation for quite some time, and there's some major racial inequalities there. So if we were to do that, we just want to make sure that certain Black communities in particular, who do need to get certain historic preservation sites approved, can get through that process, because they're struggling to get through that process now, but then also furthermore, get the tax credits to actually improve and lift up that site.
Thank you.
I think to those couple of points and to your presentation, I think Alice is right, and maybe Senator Fuller can correct me. I don't think that, to my knowledge, no one has pushed for fair housing like you pushed since I've been involved in public life. So thank you for that. And that doesn't mean it's easy, because when I was lobbying HUD, when you know, Obama was president in part and Biden was president in part, it was exhausting to get the administration to actually believe in fair housing. And this guy and this administration does not. And it's not just him, there are a lot of human beings who just don't believe. So big thank you. On the other part of what you said, the historic piece is most relevant to the Melbourne project. And JD and I voted no problem. That was one person really driving a whole bunch of NIMBY stuff. And I'll say the word NIMBY, I don't have a problem with it. So the challenge of passing an ordinance that codifies the HRI is that it would be a lengthy process. And if you ask me whether I would like to get into that intricate and try and preserve, because we had a Hotel Pentagon project last week, and there's historic stuff there which I want to listen to, and I know the board does, JD, and we all do. So there is some conceptual and philosophic battles we have to fight. And then there are other instances where I just want to prove projects that are affordable housing in practice. And that's why, for me at least, I'd rather think about your amendments that you sent us in December more, and think about those changes to an ordinance, than get all wrapped up in a lengthy discussion about the historic, the possibility of the historic. Because the primary historic problem that I can think of over the last 3 years was the Melwood project. It extended it a little bit, but I don't think that long. We passed it. It was not hard. There was long discussion. We listened, but it was a red brick building from the 1960s. Is not a historic school that we have to stop 150 people from getting new historic. So I just want to, as we think about all the questions, I wanted to frame up that is the challenge we're working with, which is we want to be strong on principle, but we don't want to get mired in a philosophic discussion when we just want to approve and engage good projects.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, I think part of it too is Melwood is the top of mind example where it's actually happening, where they're forcing it to go through the historic preservation process. I think the threat is there more broadly. You saw with Clarendon Presbyterian Church, the neighbors were threatening to, we're going to get you declared historic, and then you can't redevelop your church that is unaffordable for you to keep. But they don't care. They just want to stop the development or potential development. So it's a threat of, we're a civic association, we have a bunch of lawyers who are ready to stop your affordable housing project, and we're going to use whatever tools we can, and if we can use affordable housing, we'll do it. Or sorry, historic preservation, we'll do that. So I think, and that project was canceled, and they said we can't afford to move forward with this, which is unfortunate. So I think it's, yes, Melwood is where it's happening, but I think we're hearing more about threats of using that to stop, potential other affordable housing projects.
I want to understand more about what's happening with Melwood, because I passed a bill, General Assembly passed it, signed by the government, that would, if a site is declared historic, it has to be declared historic by the county board. Then from the application approval from the board to demolish the building, you have to delay 30 days before the approval and the issuance.
Right.
That's it. So how is it, and I've been told that it's because of that bill, how is it that those conditions have not been met under Melwood? Melwood property is not declared historic by the county board. One condition on that. Second condition is there hasn't been an application to demolish. So how is it that historic preservation is stalling the Melwood process from meeting the site plan from meeting?
Matt, or G, you're probably best position to answer that.
They're intentionally trying to mislead about the way your bill was written. A couple of neighbors potentially trying to mislead. But beyond that, we passed it. Now there are tax credits. This board member, and I don't mean JD, I can't say, but we're not slowing down because of that. They're just demo-diving off of your bill. Yeah. And so you're right, they're not slowing down. It's just, it took a little, maybe there was a little bit more process for SBRC, one more meeting or something, because it was an effort to mislead about what your bill said.
Can I, for 1 second? This may be helpful.
I mean, I spoke to the Attorney General's office, and one thing that they really are good for is they have these land use attorneys that are going to issue a formal advisory opinion on the law. And so if there's any talk about this legislation stalling this process, it is untrue. It's infactual. But I think some historic preservation people would like it to be the case. But it is not and should not slow up this property or anything else. And so when the advisory opinion should come out in July, I think we just make very clear that that's the law, and anyone who says differently can talk to the attorneys.
Thank you, Patrick.
One question, when I was on the board and we were talking about historic preservation, which always came up, and then, of course, this was the Clarendon Baptist Church, which was one of the first in the country that we got affordable housing above the church. But I don't want to tell you what kind of struggle that was. But what I will say is we determined that the steeple was historic, but the rest of the building was not. So you can look at things in a very microscopic way and maybe decide one portion or one external element is historic, but not the whole thing. And then you can move forward. And the other thing, which I'm sure this county board is doing, because we've all done it, is you can agree to have markers on the inside of the building, et cetera, et cetera. So there are ways you can address that historic landmark review constituency without holding up a project that is so desperately needed.
For time purposes, maybe one more question.
I have read a report by a law firm complimenting Arlington County for never having had a racially discriminatory law. Since 1901, what are the racially discriminatory laws that Arlington County has passed?
So that is a broad question. So, and I don't know the report specifically you're referring to. So whether the ordinances of the counties adopted ever explicitly said we are doing this because we don't like black people, that very well may be the case. But there's a lot of evidence. If you look at like the county's ban on row houses in the 1930s, that happened specifically because they did not want people of color like living in Arlington. So there's a lot of evidence that says certain zoning measures were adopted specifically to keep people out of the county and the community that the board at that time and a lot of the people who lived here did not want because they were racist. Whether they included that actual language in there or that was explicit, I don't think it was explicit, but that was why those things were adopted, and I think that was very clear at the time, and it's clear, looking back at the historical accounts. But it could very well be that Arlington has no law that says, or has never had a law that said, if you're a person of color, you can't do this or something. I don't know if that's the case, but I guess it's possible. But they certainly did things motivated by racism and by segregation, because they want, if you look at our historically black neighborhoods, they exist because black people were not allowed to live anywhere else in the county. And there were a whole lot of things that our government did, as well as the private sector, to keep black people confined to very specific neighborhoods in the county. So, yeah, hopefully that answers your question. I don't know if anyone else has anything else they want to add to that, but
Our schools, before we integrated our schools, we spent a decade and a half in court opposing the integration of our schools. At least, maybe it's 20 years, but that's a fact. If you go back, there's case after case where we said, no, you can't come to a different school. And so, I don't know whether 15 or 25 years, but in the course of learning about how good Arlington has been and that we were one of the first to integrate in Virginia, it's also true that for a long time before that, we turned down plaintiff after plaintiff who said, let me attend a high school that is integrated. And so that's not a statute, but it sure is a deep, long history in my view.
yeah, and I don't remember the role in the Halls Hill wall, but the community literally built a wall to separate black and white people in Halls Hill. That parts of it still exist in the picture there. So whether that was, I don't know what, if any role like the county government had in that, but certainly allowed it to happen and sanctioned it. But we have a deep-rooted history of racism in Arlington County. And whether it's always explicit in the laws that we've passed, certainly a lot has been motivated by that. I think that will be our last question. But thank you all very much for listening to my presentation. We do have our closing remarks from the Honorable J.D. Spain. I will also be around after to chat with folks if they have questions or they want to get more involved in the Housing Commission or the NAACP.